Well, thank you very much for all of you for coming. I understand you get credit points for doing this. So you've been bribed to come, I think. And thank you for Nil and John for inviting me to the Global Media Research Institute. It's really great to come and have a look around here, actually, and see what you're all doing. And I think I'm on the way to NCA, so it worked really well with some travel arrangements. So, okay, what I'm going to talk to you about is some work I've been doing on issues around activism in New Zealand, and especially the biotechnology debate, which is an area I've been involved in for a few years. And one of the areas which got me interested in the whole field of public relations, which I now work in. I used to work much more in a media studies department, but moved over to work in public relations because I was quite interested in the politics of public relations and critical work. So I hope you don't mind if I take the indulgence of kind of reading this paper. I'm sure I'll get bored before you, though, and throw it away or something. So because I've got a bit of time, and I thought it would be nice to not have to do an 8-minute conference presentation, and actually to deal with the whole thing, and you can ask me in-depth critical and theoretical questions then. So I'm going to provide you a bit of an explanation of some of this, because I don't know how well you all know New Zealand. I think the past decade has witnessed a significant increase in attempts to acknowledge and theorise the function and strategies of activist groups in their quest to influence public opinion, corporate behaviour and government policy. Public relations scholars have been especially interested in understanding the place of activism in circuits of communication and decision-making processes, following recognition that dominant public relations theories and models have prioritised the needs and interests of invisible clients who set the public relations research agenda and truncated our intellectual vision. That is, public relations scholarship has been dominated by attendance to the needs, interests and theorising of what we would kind of call best practice behaviours of the resource-rich organisations operating in neoliberal democracies. When public relations scholars have turned to consider the place and operation of activist groups, the tendency has been to position them as a type of public that has been encountered by a corporate organisation and with whom conflicts should be resolved to effect win-win outcomes for both parties. Alternatively, activist groups have been discussed in the same terms as corporate organisations, in that, like corporate organisations, their goals are to communicate positions on and shape public policy, remain viable as an organisation, and adapt to changes in their environment. Consequently, the two-way symmetrical model of communication was advocated as the best practice approach to working with and for activist concerns. Dozier and Lausen argue that against the temptation to regard activist groups as either similar to other publics that an organisation might encounter, or similar to organisations with highly resourced public relations departments whose task it is to reconcile differences that might exist between an organisation and its publics. Indeed, in calling public relations scholarship and praxis to better understand activist groups, Dozier and Lausen encourage public relations scholars to examine how we might theorise the problem of irreconcilable difference while crediting the position of such difference as legitimate, and its disconfirmation of our non-methetic model of public relations. My own interest in examining activism in this paper is to explore how New Zealand anti-genetic engineering activist group Mothers Against Genetic Engineering, and that is this group, and the short for Mothers Against Genetic Engineering is MAD, and a lot of people ask me what that means, but you can see it means either MAD, GE, or it symbolises a kind of woman's name, Madge. How this group both strategically and discursively framed genetic engineering as a new science, and how they positioned themselves and their concerns in relation to this science in an effort to affect both public opinion and government policy during the 2001 to 2003 period of their campaigning. What is especially interesting about the Madge campaign was its highly emotive, woman-centred, anti-positivistic representation of an issue that at a time when GE was being presented as a highly rational and technological means of contributing to the betterment of environmental and human health dilemmas. Related to this area are the tactics that Madge used in their campaign, which I'll talk about, the use of the Carnivalesque and the Fool, which attempted to undermine both the hierarchies and official dominant discourses that were being established around the health, environmental and national capital and human resource values of New Zealand's adoption of a pro-GE science industry. The analysis of these strategies and the tactics demonstrate how activist groups necessarily need to work to expose, make controversial and undermine the ideological values of those corporate, institutional and government stakeholders in order that other publics might be better equipped to consider how they negotiate their own relationships and positions on certain controversial issues. In considering the Madge campaign, the paper also considers how moving beyond the use of the Carnivalesque and in combining this with what I've called bureaucratic tactics, which is an approach advocated by someone who's tried to do some work published in Text and Performance Quarterly called Chavasta, represented an attempt to directly affect government policy, but also led to the demise of the group. Chavasta really advocated the need to combine a kind of bureaucratic approach with a Carnivalesque if anything was going to be achieved. The paper explores how we can understand and theorise the acts conducted by Madge in its aims to promote understanding of activism against GE through its intentional use of exaggeration, drama and spectacle, combined with its attempts to situate itself as a public interest watchdog organisation. I'm just going to explain a little bit to you about the New Zealand context because you need to understand that and to understand this campaign. In the late 1990s, genetic engineering became a matter of public concern and controversy in New Zealand when it's discovered that foods containing GE ingredients were being sold in supermarkets, and GE research was being conducted within public and private sector research institutions. None of us really knew about this at the time. Following pressure exerted on the then minority Labour-led coalition government by the Green and Alliance coalition partners after the 1999 election, a Royal Commission of Inquiry into GM was established in July 2000. The Royal Commission, intended as it was to inform the nation's GE policy, sought the views of a broad range of New Zealand and international scientists and other expert witnesses. However, its consultation with the public was criticised as limited, and only groups deemed to be interested parties were given the opportunity to present evidence through any other mechanism than the written submissions. In July 2001, in its report of July 2001, the Royal Commission of Inquiry recommended that New Zealand should preserve its opportunities and that medical research and commercial field trials of GE crops and products should be allowed. You had to go through a regulatory application to do that sort of research, but it was a significant step for New Zealand to allow commercial field trials of genetic engineering products. What happened then, a moratorium on field trials was extended to October 2003 while regulatory frameworks were put in place because we actually didn't have very robust frameworks at that time. The Royal Commission's report was received with consternation by anti-GE groups who, as well as objecting to the safety claims made about GE science, regarded New Zealand as threatening its clean green image by allowing the release of GE organisms into the environment. Consequently, the period after the report saw the coming together of a range of diverse anti-GE groups under the banner of what was called the GE Free Coalition. Groups in this coalition range from Greenpeace New Zealand, the Safe Food Campaign, Soil and Health New Zealand, and the Biodynamic Gardening and Farming Association. At the time, a new anti-GE activist group emerged, and that was Mothers Against Genetic Engineering, which adopted a satirical acronym which encapsulated both its view of GE and the woman-centred nature of the organisation Madge. Madge described itself as a network of politically aligned women who have decided to actively resist the use of genetically engineered organisms in our food and in our land. The group was the brainchild of a woman called Alana Curry, a member of the 1980s pop band Thompson Twins. If you've got as bad a pop music taste as I have, you will remember this band because I thought they were great. But anything you read about them says they were absolutely trash. They were living at the time. Alana Curry and her husband Tom Baker, who's now is a kind of well-known kind of techno pop producer now, were living in the middle-class suburb of Auckland with their 2 children. Curry's concerns about GE came as a direct and traumatic experience of what at first to be a major food safety issue. In the year 2000 in the UK, Curry's sister died of suspected Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which called CJD. Initially, it thought she was suffering from the variant mad cow disease type of CJD, which comes from eating contaminated beef. Although an autopsy identified her as having suffered the natural occurring classical form of the disease, Curry is said to suspect the autopsy did not reveal the whole truth. Curry said that it was during her research into her sister's illness that she discovered the relationship between the new variant CJD, that's mad cow disease, and the eating of contaminated beef. This led her into the world of food technology and genetic engineering. After her sister's death, Curry attended a public lecture in Auckland by a guy called Professor Arpad Putztai. Now, if any of you know about the biotechnology debate, that name will be really familiar. He was brought to New Zealand to give evidence to the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Genetic Modification. There, Putztai reported on his research findings that feeding rats genetically engineered food had negative effects on their immune system. And it's very notorious, his work, because it's been claimed that he proved that, but other people have really disclaimed and discredited his research. And he suffered a lot as a consequence of that. Curry is said to have left the lecture disturbed that she had been unwittingly feeding her own children food that contaminated GE ingredients, and after further research of her own concluded that GE was a new science. It's an experiment. She said it's an experiment and as such should be contained to safe, secure laboratories and not allowed out in the world. In response to the Royal Commission on Genetic Engineering's decision that New Zealand should proceed with caution, as it put it, but could continue with GE field trials, Curry has stated that she was motivated by anger and righteous indignation and became involved in a campaign to confine GE research to laboratories and the labelling of foods containing GE ingredients in the supermarkets. On the 31st of March 2002, she launched the group Mothers Against Genetic Engineering with a 6-course, $2,000 per head banquet feast for 200 people at St Matthew's Church in the Auckland City. That's it's not just a church, it's kind of a community space. Created by celebrity restaurant chefs and including performances from high-profile New Zealand artists, the fundraising event was billed as a wild, stylish, highly creative celebration of New Zealand food and wine, and highlighted the need for our country to retain its clean green image in the world and keep out genetically engineered food. Madge's approach was to appeal to create awareness among and educate New Zealanders about genetic engineering. However, it particularly focused its attention on women, who its researchers identified as purchasing 80% of the food bought in New Zealand. Furthermore, the group sought to present anti-GE activism as stylish, creative, sexy and fashionable, and to recruit supporters who may not have otherwise wanted to align themselves with the green hippie anti-establishment identity imposed by the media and pro-GE lobby on other anti-GE activist groups. I think to some people it's really surprising that that being a greenie in New Zealand is kind of denigrated as being a hippie lifestyle. Even though New Zealand has this kind of clean green environmental image, it's actually not very trendy to be an environmentalist. A bit further on in this presentation, I'll explore how the Madge campaign drew on elements of the Carnivalesque in publicising its campaign agenda. First, I want to explore some of the arguments around activism and the Carnivalesque in the literature. Given that the value of this form of performative political resistance has been a focus of some scepticism and critiqued as an ineffective means of achieving change. Chavasta argues for the need to combine Carnivalesque with bureaucratic tactics, which focus on effecting institutional government change. Madge did indeed combine theatrical protest with bureaucratic ones in that they promoted consumer activism through a purse power initiative which encouraged the buying of GE-free brands. Furthermore, Madge sought to position itself as in a critical watchdog role by taking the Environment Minister and the Environmental Risk Management Authority to court in 2003. Let's just have a look at some of the issues around the use of Carnivalesque. Much has been written about the use of Carnivalesque performance by activist groups. Both the WTO anti-globalisation protests and the movement against the US and British invasion of Iraq post 9/11 have attracted the attention of academic research and writing. And Brunner, someone who writes in this area, has claimed that the most effective way of addressing state corruption, at least under certain circumstances, is through the creative use of Carnivalesque protest. There's a picture to keep you busy. With its origins stretching back as far as Roman times and continuing through the early Christian, medieval and Renaissance periods, the Carnival Festival provided a brief window of opportunity when hegemonic social roles were reversed and usual restrictions on public behaviour were officially relaxed, ultimately to reinforce normal public order. So carnivals were taken as a time when people could kind of behave in grotesque and crazy ways and undermine the authorities that they were normally expected to live under, but then the authority was reinstated. In these terms, the carnival is a theatrical manifestation in which authority figures and norms of behaviours guiding our socialisation become questioned and their rigid structure turns problematic. Following Stalibas and White, Brunner defines the Carnivalesque as characterised by a potent populist critical intervention of all official words and hierarchies, the suspension of all hierarchical rank, privileges, norms and prohibitions, positive degradation and humiliation and attitude of creative disrespect, and a temporary retextualising of social formation that exposes their fictive foundations. Humour plays a highly prominent role in the Carnivalesque and its ability to undermine dominant hierarchies and norms. Indeed, Bakhtan states that the carnival is that peculiar folk humour that always existed and never merged with the official culture of the ruling classes. Parody and irony have consequently played a prominent role in the Carnivalesque, and spectacle is an important means of expression of this form of humour. Guy Debord's 1967 book Society of Spectacle has been especially valuable in directing scholars to think about how the Carnivalesque is used by activist groups. Debord's analysis of the spectacle of consumption shifted the focus of Marxist analysis from that of production to product promotion and those acts of consumption. Following Debord, David Boget, who's written quite a lot about Carnivalesque, and quite a lot of it's available on the web, writes that spectacle is a narrative and a theatric performance that legitimates, rationalises and camouflages violent production and consumption. In these terms, spectacle has been associated with corporate advertising, product and brand promotion, and propaganda tactics as well, and is actually considered different in rhetoric than carnival. So I'm trying to encourage you not to get confused between spectacle and carnival. Spectacle plays on the group motive to band together and share in icons and symbolism, such that the same attitudes to fashion, language, consumption and production develop. And kind of at the margins of that, there might be resistance. Spectacle has been theorised then as symbolism, the hyperreal, and as encouraging a separation of appreciation of the real, where the symbolic is the commodification and valued more than what it represents. In contrast to this, the carnival represents an attempt to subvert and parody the society of spectacle. So here's kind of some attempts by the anti-Nike campaigners to subvert that spectacle. An obvious example of this is the anti-sweatshop campaign against Nike, which sought to make associations in the public mind between highly priced sports shoes and sweatshop workers who suffered very poor working conditions in their production. Well, some people really praise the use of Carnivalesque in activism. Other writers, such as Chavasta and also another fairly right-wing writer called Weisberg, have questioned the efficacy value of such performance protest and called for the Carnivalesque to be combined with bureaucratic tactics that might actually demonstrate a tangible efficacy, to actually demonstrate some change has been achieved, such as changes to policy or regulatory structures. So I think whilst Carnivalesque has become a very popular form of protest, a lot of people are actually saying, but has it actually achieved anything, this kind of performance street theatre? I'm also somewhat interested, and I need to develop the paper a bit more around this, how the expression and even exploitation of emotion for the purpose of generating public opinion has often been denigrated and associated with irrational personal psychological reactions as opposed to rational objective information. Emotion in this view thwarts our wiser intentions and prevents effective actions. However, despite attempts to conceal the emotionality of their arguments, it does affect emotional responses that political organisers appeal to arouse, manipulate and sustain and recruit and retain members. And I think a lot of the Carnivalesque does try and create feelings of emotion which otherwise get lost from these sorts of campaigns. Following the report of, let's go back to the New Zealand context now. Following the report of the Royal Commission into Genetic Modification in 2001, anti-GE activist groups in New Zealand faced the issue of how to represent GE as something other than an innovative scientific technology which New Zealand needed to adopt so as to maintain its credibility as a significant player in both global and scientific and agricultural economies. And I don't think you can really underestimate the problems that New Zealand has begun to suffer in maintaining itself in the first world economy, because a lot of the OECD indicators suggest that New Zealand is actually really in quite jeopardy of falling down the economic scalings. And it's partly because we're very, very much an agricultural-based economy, and there's been a big drive to try and develop the New Zealand economy into a knowledge-based economy, and biotechnology is very much part of that drive. So the report of the Royal Commission and the pro-GE lobby, represented by those organising actually under a group called the Life Sciences Network. The Life Sciences Network is a group made up of largely research organisations in New Zealand. I've actually kind of put the photograph of these two guys on it. It's incredibly cynical what happened in New Zealand. This guy is practically like Dr. Death in public relations circles. He's a man who's really brought in to achieve public relations aims for organisations, and he will do them in extremely devious ways. But he's, very, very effective in achieving goals. His task was simply to make sure that the GM moratorium was lifted on the 29th of October 2003, and that was his job. And at midnight, when that was achieved, his job was he no longer had a job. And this was the guy who was the head of the Life Sciences Network, which Francis Weaver's worked for, William Rolleston. And I find it quite curious. These are kind of typical men in suits, and I'm talking about Mothers Against Genetic Engineering. And then these research organisations in New Zealand, our research organisations are partly government funded, and they have to match that government funding with private funding. So it's a slightly complex way that research funding occurs in New Zealand because of the nature of the country. So people like the Life Sciences Network position GE as holding exciting promise, not only for conquering diseases, eliminating pests, and contributing to the knowledge economy, but for enhancing the international competitiveness of the primary industries so important to our country's economic well-being. Adopting an oppositional position to this framing of GE was likely to put anti-GE groups at risk of being cast as regressive and Luddite. Indeed, the type of rational, scientific, positivistic, empirical, and I should be careful putting those words together, but that sort of thinking that supported biotechnological research and its commercialization has really been in hegemonic ascendancy since the 18th century Enlightenment and is associated with achievement and progress. So how to counter those sort of arguments is really difficult. So with GE epitomising the dominant Western science-based knowledge systems, New Zealand government policymakers projected the nation as being on the cutting edge of knowledge and technology through support for genetic engineering science. The challenge for the anti-GE movement was one of how to prevent their systematic labelling by government and pro-GE lobbyists as green hippies, and to attract the attention of New Zealand public and media, while projecting their cause as a legitimate position that people could visually identify with and which deserved sympathy and support. Now, Mothers Against Genetic Engineering obviously draws associations with other organisations, which I'm sure you have some here, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Like MADGE both frames mothers as protecting children against the risks that they are unable to control, and as having an emotional relationship connection to those innocent members of the public that they were seeking to protect. In these terms, MADGE purposefully positioned themselves as emotionally driven. but also as a socially legitimate group of politically concerned women and appealing to other mothers through common shared moral values, assumptions and belief. Thus, they offered a frame of concern that would fit with potential recruits and supporters. In these terms, Madge created an emotional space for protests that other organisations such as Greenpeace and another prominent anti-GE group called Scientists for Responsible Genetics were unable to occupy. Greenpeace and Scientists for Responsible Genetics were really constrained by a need to maintain a kind of respectable professional position in this debate and to maintain kind of rational organisational identities, especially given their potential to be dismissed as out of the mainstream. Madge also had this problematic to negotiate, but here it was Alana Curry, who you'll see here on the left. Her status worked to achieve considerable advantage for the group. Curry's experience as a 1980s New Zealand pop celebrity icon had really taught her how to both attract and manage media attention. And if you do, there's documentaries about the Thompson twins on YouTube, and if you watch any of those, they very much talk about how Lana Curry and Tom Baker were really very clever at manipulating the media, and they were kind of, one of the real first pop bands before Stock Aitken and Walkman to kind of package pop music for the media. In addition, Curry's own public profile, along with those of the Auckland music, arts and theatre scene that she associated with, provided Madge with a kind of bohemian chic image that not only gained media attention, but brought the group cultural capital and credibility among the middle New Zealand. As one New Zealand journalist, Gilbert Wong wrote, "The Madge formula largely laid out by Curry, mixing striking imagery with hip, ironic humour and a headline-grabbing stunts. Madge might not be the biotech scientist's best friend, but neither does the group possess anything remotely closely to the knit-your-own-yoghurt earnestness of traditional environmentalism. Curry likes a laugh, a smoke and a drink. She gets about town in a big, shiny, black four-wheel drive Jeep Grand Cherokee." So she obviously had a lot of status, say. That's quite novel in New Zealand. I can tell it's not very novel here to behave like that. Yeah. Prior to the formulation of Madge, Curry was credited as pushing GE into the mainstream political debate with the 2,000-strong march she organised up Auckland's Queen Street, with the effect that all the antennas went up in the political circles because she was not just seen, nobody had seen these sort of numbers protesting about anything for a very long time in New Zealand, probably since the anti-nuclear movement happened many years before, and New Zealand achieved its anti-nuclear national identity. The spectacle of such public protest and seeking to promote attention to their cause was not all that Madge focused on, however. Rather, they sought to use their power as women consumers to effect change in food purchasing and to put pressure on corporate supermarkets to label food products containing GE ingredients. This was done through the use of what was called a purse power campaign. Highlighting women's awareness and participation in purse power involved both theatrical performance protest and an educational toolkit in the form of a small pink credit-sized card detailing some products to avoid, how to get in touch with Madge, and urging people to use their purse power and stop buying GE food. These were distributed outside supermarkets. In the first of such protests, Auckland's Richmond supermarket in May 2000, women filled shopping trolleys like this with food, took them to the checkout and then demanded to see the manager and get some assurance that the food did not contain GE. When this could not be done, they then left the food at the checkout and walked out with their shopping trolleys empty. This form of consumer activism was intended to alert the corporate retailers and farmers to the threat they faced if they continued to support the development of GE foods. Positioning this action as discursively that of caring and concerned mothers, Hilary Ord, a fashionable Auckland restaurant owner and one of the kind of leaders of Madge, stated, "For thousands of years, women have known knowingly and intuitively and instinctively what to feed their children. There's something about this product, this development, this technology, the very core of my being says no, wrong. To be able to read a food label is the most powerful way to shop right now, so you don't become a victim and we refuse to be victims." Emphasising the place of women in the consumer campaign and using tactics deliberately designed to appeal to women, Madge conducted protests on Mother's Day 2002, which heavily featured the pink colour in their protests. These were in the clothes they wore, in their banners, T-shirts and newsletters. And they used the mother's breast as a particular feature of their campaign, displaying large, only pink bras at many of their activities. Indeed, the symbol of the mother's breast and the goodness of mother's milk as natural and as far superior to GE-based products became a heavy feature of Madge's Carnivalesque form of protest. This campaign strategy was then extended to protests against the Crown Research Institute, Ag Research, which was one of those research institutes which was a member of the Life Sciences Organisation. Ag Research had put what we call an umbrella application into the Environmental Risk Management Authority to develop transgenic cattle by inserting human as well as other mammal genes into cows to produce this is very complicated, but to produce transgenic calves, which would in turn produce milk containing specific types of human protein not usually found in dairy milk. The reason for this was to create milk which was evidently or supposedly help sufferers of multiple sclerosis. At this point, however, Madge, while continuing with its use of theatrical carnivalesque performance, took on the role of public interest legal watchdog group. And you can see this. It was claimed in Ag Research's application to the Environmental Risk Management Authority that the ultimate purpose of introducing a novel protein into the milk is the development and production of pharmaceutical products to meet yet unmet human health clinical needs. It was reported that the protein-based milk could help sufferers of diseases, and they wanted umbrella-type approval to streamline the consent process. So it was a fairly significant application in those terms to actually ask for approval to do all this kind of genetic research at once. It was the first application to be lodged involving animals of GE research since the establishment of the Royal Commission as well. And IRMA, the Environmental Risk Management Authority, actually granted the application. Madge, which had its own what they called legal queen representative, Kate Wood, however, set about making a legal case against IRMA's decision and mounted a case for its judicial review. Madge's case, which we can only assume was purely coincidental, took a symbolic 9 months to prepare, claimed that, 1, the Minister of the Environment, Marion Hobbs, should have used her call-in powers to fully consider the health and safety environmental aspects of the Ag Researchers' transgenic application. Secondly, that the application should have been judged a field test, because if you're producing these animals, they go out and eat in fields. And there should have been considered under the stringent laws of what we have another act that you have to apply under the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act. And thirdly, that IRMA had failed to give weight to the ethical issues surrounding the application. More broadly, Madge claimed that the objective for taking the case to court was to heighten public awareness of the GE issue and to stimulate and promote informed and meaningful debate. At every point in this case, the broader ethical, social, environmental issues and enormity of what we are taking on, according to Madge, was at the forefront of our minds. In overcoming the first hurdle to bringing their case to court, the judiciary lent some support to Madge's objective. Ag Research, the research organisation, put up a strenuous case against the judicial review going to court, arguing that Madge should pay security for Ag Research's costs before the case went ahead. In rejecting Ag Research's claim and deciding that the case should proceed to court, the presiding judge, Judge France, argued that there were merits in the case in terms of public interest, fairness and justice, and that the role performed by voluntary community groups such as Madge was an important one. She also said that the findings would assist the Minister of Environment and the Environmental Risk Management Authority in approaching other applications in future. When the 4-day hearing of Madge versus IRMA and the Ministry of the Environment opened in the High Court on the 10th of June 2003, Madge used the occasion for some further prankster tactics. Madge members staged a silent protest adorned in large full-head plastic cows outside the court in Auckland, and in Wellington, Madge mothers served milk garnished with mice at a local park. Juggle some papers here. Madge, however, lost the case, and Irma's decision to approve the transgenic cattle experiment was upheld in court. Furthermore, the presiding judge, now Judge Protter, it's not the same as the previous judge I just talked about, ordered Madge to pay 24,000 New Zealand dollars to ag research and court costs. In effect, this court decision caused Madge to have to disband for fear of the personal assets of its members being seized. However, this was not before Madge conducted two final tactics of theatrical political protest. The first of these came in the form of a controversial billboard advertising campaign featuring a full-breasted naked woman in the stance of a cow with on her hands and knees on the floor and with a milking machine, attached to her breasts. Copies of the billboard were posted on commercial hoardings in both Auckland and Wellington, where they attracted considerable media publicity and controversy. The image used in the billboard makes, perhaps not obvious to everyone, reference to the ag research genetic experiments that sought to have cows express milk containing human protein. Clearly, the imagery stretches the point in its suggestion that humans are being genetically engineered and commodified. Nevertheless, Madge were accused, especially by the pro-GE science lobby, of misrepresentation. Curra's response that only stupid white men would read the imagery in this way, and she declared the intention was merely to promote discussion and debate about GE. In more theoretical terms, the Cowgirl poster works to expose the hidden and economic gender politics of the science administration and attempts to open up the space for democratic debate of scientific agendas, especially in terms of morals and ethics. It is a grotesque depiction. It's ridiculous, it's degrading, it's farcical, resistant, it is a world turned upside down. And in these terms, I would suggest highly carnivalesque. However, ironically, the Advertising Standards Authority received a number of complaints about the billboard on just these grounds, that it was indecent. Complaints which the authority actually upheld, leading to the banning of the representation and the demands for its refusal removal from commercial hoarding sites. In effect, the self-regulatory monitoring system of the capital advertising industry silenced the culture-jamming discourse of the cowgirl and claimed a victory on ethical high ground of protecting the New Zealand public from Madge's acts of indecency. The final act of resistance conducted by Madge comprised Madge members storming the New Zealand Houses of Parliament dressed in pink bras and calling for New Zealand to adopt a GE-free policy. This action was dubbed anti-democratic by the Speaker of the House, who served trespass orders on the women, which would result in their being arrested if they returned to Parliament within 2 years of the order. Once again, then, Madge's attempt to create awareness and raise consciousness about GE was closed down, and public interest fused with corporate interest against the theatrics of rant and madness that seeks to repair felt separation and alienation. Ultimately, however, Madge was unable to sustain its presence in New Zealand's GE debate, and as we have seen, became something of a classic victim of what Bruner terms the Humorless State. Bruner argues that corrupt governments populated by people wanting to use political power to maintain their unjust advantages have a very limited sense of humour and stifle public critique to maintain their status. Required to pay court costs for what was originally judged a case grounded in public interest, fairness and justice, found ethically indecent by the Advertising Standards Authority and banned from Parliament for undemocratic behaviour, Madge came up against a political economic system that could not tolerate public criticism and irony. In a number of ways, we can also consider the role played by Madge in the GE debate like that of the Shakespearean fool. Shakespeare's fools are neither consistent in their character or in dramatic function. Yet there is a sense that his primary role is of a truth speaker who is able to be outrageous in his speech, if not in action, because his status denies any license to action. And one of the writers who writes about King Lear states that The fool voices, as it were, the principles of obscenity, the summing up of all those obscenities which lie threateningly beneath the surface of decencies, pieties, and traditional observances, the function of which is to ensure the health of individual psyches and social institutions. Similarly, a writer called Roberta Merlini argues that fools disrupt this traditional order of society and the meaning of conventional language, while another writer, Lippincott, has described the fool in King Lear as one who cleverly and indirectly opened up new worlds of understanding to a king gone mad. In attempting to insert emotions and instincts as legitimate concepts and feelings into the GE debate and the language of that debate, Madge challenges the privileged hierarchy of rational, scientific, positivist discourse. As an activist organisation espousing the values of women and mothers, Madge gave voice to and sought legitimacy for the procreative and instinctive habits of nature, behaviours and emotions that rationality denies of having any scientific credibility. They also attempted to claim a legitimate position for mother's intuition, the intuition that feeding children GE food could have long-term damaging consequences. Far from promoting biotechnology as a tool of man's rational and virtuous domination over nature, this perspective positions man as, conversely, the potential depraved victim of his own demise, the Dr. Frankenstein who creates the monster that runs amok and kills its own inventor. In reclaiming the privileged position for the irrational forces and feelings of nature, Madge sought to re-establish the figure of Mother Nature as a force that could not be controlled, but which needs respecting in terms of its own troubling and disorientating powers and in its power to subvert GE technology. And these terms, Alana Curry stated in an interview I did with her, once you put out there GE, you ain't going to get it back. The seeds are tiny, nature is sexy. That's what it's all about. Nature wants to shag the next things to it, and it will do. That's what seeds do. That's their purpose. So you will contaminate, and there will be no choice. In contradicting and challenging rational scientific risk assessment-based arguments about the probable safety of GE technologies, Madge, like the Shakespearean fool, reminds us of the vanity of human wishes. Interestingly, the true parent of King Lear's fool is Mother Nature, a loving and communal character who is set in dialectical opposition to the rapacious individualistic atheism of that Edmund character, who might be seen as a kind of parallel to the corporate profit-driven companies that were associated with the campaign to have New Zealand government lift the moratorium on GE field trials. In bringing this paper to an end, I think I should return to its title, Tragedy in Two Parts, and try and explain why I wrote that title. I think there's something that appears utterly tragic in the demise of Mothers Against Genetic Engineering. Here was a group that attempted to bring an emotional, legitimately irrational, theatrical and comic perspective to the GE debate. A group that challenged us to think about the morals and ethics of biotechnology and not to take ourselves too seriously. Madge encouraged New Zealand to look at the obscenity of its pro-genetic engineering activities. The first tragedy is that this group, which encouraged a festival of political participation, agitation and discussion, was effectively killed off by a state and regulatory mechanisms that took themselves too seriously. The second tragedy is that New Zealand lifted the GE moratorium on the 29th of October 2003 in a public climate of confusion and cynicism. Polls found that 70% of the New Zealand public opposed the commercial field trials of GE products when the moratorium was lifted. In this context, the New Zealand state was in a very poor health. Its people appear to have felt subjected to legislation that supported the needs and interests of an economic ideology rather than the interests of the general public, though the government, of course, argued that economic and public interests were one and the same thing. But perhaps the point is that in literally running Madge out of town, the New Zealand state demonstrated an intolerance of citizens who are capable of irony, an intolerance of ambiguity and dissensus, and of critical public entertainment. In the larger picture of the public's politics of citizenship, groups like Madge play an important role in democratic debate and representation. And as public relations scholars, we could perhaps turn our attention to the merits of activism more often than we do. Thank you very much.